Welcome to the webinar. Today's webinar will be on international UX and CX. My name is Priscilla Giles, and first I'd like to start with a little bit of housekeeping. The webinar will start in a few moments and will be hosted by Tarja Karjalainen, Localization Manager, International UX and CX at HappyOrNot, and María Jesús de Arriba Díaz, Strategic Accounts Director at Vistatec. We will be hosting a Q&A towards the end of the webinar. In order to ask questions to Tarja today, simply go to your GoToWebinar panel on your screen, and about halfway down, you'll see a questions box. Simply type your question here, and we'll do our best to answer them in our Q&A later. If you're joining us today here live, thanks very much indeed for your time. And if you're listening to this recording, of course, thanks for listening. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Tarja Karjalainen.
Hi everybody, and apologies for my voice. This is María from Vistatec. Thank you very much for the introduction, Priscilla, and hello everyone. Apologies, as I said, this sounds much worse than it is, I promise. We have been waiting and wanting to bring this live webinar to you for quite some time. So despite my voice, I wasn't going to delay it any longer. I hope it is not too painful for you guys to listen to it either live or recorded. So many thanks again for joining us today for this first webinar in our new UX and CX webinar series. Just before we get started and I introduce you to our fantastic guest, Tarja, I'd like to say a few words about Vistatec very briefly. We have been helping global organizations with their international content strategy for over 20 years, providing business and technology solutions that accelerate their global success. We understand what it takes to be successful on a global scale, and we focus on supporting our clients to deliver positive experience to their own customers worldwide. Me personally, I am a strategic accounts director at Vistatec, and I wear a couple of other hats as development director with the Think Global Forum, MIA Geo Manager with Women in Localization, and more recently, as in literally earlier this week, I have been elected to the board of directors of GALA, the Globalization and Localization Association for 2020 and 2021, and I am elated but also very, very grateful to everyone for their trust. So without further ado, I'd just like to introduce you to Tarja. I know a lot of you will know Tarja. She is a trailblazer in terms of international user experience and customer experience. She's been driving this whole area forward, and I am thrilled to have her share her insights with us today. She's currently the localization manager and also heads up the international UX and CX at HappyOrNot. The company responsible for creating those kind of globally recognizable smiley feedback systems that you might have seen in airports or hotels or some stores. She has hands-on experience from both the vendor side and the client side in our industry. She has run her own company. She has led teams of localization professionals and user experience writers, and she's basically an all-rounder. She's obviously in her role. She's currently helping thousands of HappyOrNot clients on every continent gauge the satisfaction of their own customers, staff, and visitors in their own language. She is passionate about translation technology, agile localization, and user experience, as we will see in just a few moments. And I know, as I said at the beginning, many of you will recognize her from her presentations at LockWorld and other industry conferences. And she's also a regular contributor to industry podcasts and publications. So Tarja, thank you again for joining us today. I do have a very first question to you, and is the fact that it's unusual to see the title of localization manager together with international user experience and customer experience. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you've ended up managing this area at HappyOrNot?
Well, thank you, Maria, for the very nice introduction. First of all, yeah, the story of the title. When I started at HappyOrNot, it was already evident from the beginning that there was such a big and broad area of responsibility regarding localization. And you know, we all know that localization spans throughout the company, and you have so many touch points and so many stakeholders that you really have to wear so many hats. So the international user experience and customer experience was something that was sort of natural for the role here at HappyOrNot. So that's how I ended up in this role. So yeah, that's basically the story of the title.
Fascinating. Well, we look forward to hearing your experience.
Thank you. So yeah, well, thank you. I'm really happy to be part of this webinar series. Thanks so much for having me. It's such a great topic, so really privileged to talk about it. I've been working in the translation and localization industry for about 10 years now in different roles, and in all roles I feel like I've always been very close to the customer and the end user. And I always felt really privileged when I got to work in teams where I had a seat in the table when talking about the user experience. And really sort of that's how I built passion for it. I've also always felt very strongly that localization is part of UX, not something additional to it. So I've really tried to bring forward the idea that when we are making a global product, the product is just one product and localization is part of that product. It's not a feature in that product. So that's a common notion that localization is something that you add later on, and it's the language versions or it's the local versions. No, I mean, to me, it's always just the one product. Our users are our users no matter what language they speak in other words. So when we define our products, we should always design them for all of our users. But I've also noticed that this way of thinking requires a shift in people's thinking, and that's why I've started talking about international UX instead of localization where possible, because really that's what it is. It is the umbrella term for all the efforts that go into a global product. You can't really separate localization from UX if you're designing a global product. Localization is user experience. And you can't really separate internationalization from UX because it is the user's experience that we are actually enabling when we internationalize the code. I not too often even talk about translation either anymore, because I think in today's content it has kind of suffered like an inflation. It doesn't mean that we don't have localization teams and internationalization engineers or translators. It just, on the contrary, I just feel like those titles don't necessarily always describe what they do or give the word justice anymore. So I think that these people are the designers of the international user experience.
So different pieces of the jigsaw.
Exactly, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, but then why do we need to separately think of international UX? This is a question I've been asked many times. And well, I mean, my answer is that, well, the software industry, for instance, where I'm working is it's very English centric. The design language is in many companies is English. The design process is in English, and the company language is in English. It's easy to lose sight in that kind of environment who you are actually designing to, and more often than not, you are not actually designing to. You are designing to an international audience, and having your product in one language is simply not enough to capture even a fraction of the world that consumes digital products. So in fact, only roughly 20% of internet users are English speakers. So how are you going to reach the remaining 80%? And you know, all studies show that consumers want to have the option of using their own language. And you know, there's the famous "can't read, won't buy" statement, and that's true as ever, I think.
Absolutely, but there's also the fact that a lot of people, most people, are comfortable using English in certain contexts. So is it really truly necessary to approach this from an international perspective, from a multilingual perspective?
I mean, I really think it is. I mean, a very good example are the Finns. I mean, there's a very high proficiency in English in Finland, but still there's certain contents that I like to consume in Finnish and others that I like to use English for. But it's the option of having the content available in your language. It makes a real big difference. And obviously we have different markets where people are very proficient in English, but they prefer to have the content in their own language as well. And obviously there are obviously these legal requirements in many countries. And so I think that there are still, even with that idea of everybody understands English, there is a real need for localization. Yeah, but yeah, but the thing is why you need international UX is and CX is, you know, even after you get to the buy, someone buys your product, then you actually need to retain your customers. And this is where you kind of have to think about the competitive edge you have to your competitors as well. Localization, I mean, if you have a plethora of different products that are kind of the same, but you can really stand out in your localization as well. And what keeps customers coming back is the experience you offer them, and that's really where you need international user experience. So, you know, there are roughly 6,500 languages spoken in the world today. And if you look at the 6 most spoken languages, English is not the first by all means. And all the regions where most spoken languages are spoken, English is by far not the majority language there either. So, and we have 1 million internet users every day. So if you want to reach all of those people, you will need to customize your product to a much wider audience. I really personally really like to look at these reports from Hootsuite and We Are Social that so wonderfully show that there are so many internet users consuming digital content today, and they are far from a homogeneous group. There's so much cultural diversity in these users. So I always ask, why would we even consider offering the same experience to such a broad spectrum of users and consumers?
Absolutely, and cultural realities, and I guess just demographics as well within those markets, right?
Yeah, definitely. I think that whenever I share this image, people always tend to react to it like, oh wow, I never even thought about it this way. You kind of have to show them the world and then make them understand what we are actually trying to do and what are the realities that we are operating in. So localization makes a really big difference. So if you're a product designer looking at this, you might be left in a bit of despair. How am I supposed to cater to all of these different markets with my products? Do I need 10 versions of my products? What do I do? Well, kind of the answer is, well, kind of you do, but no need to despair. You can start by adopting the international user's view into your design process. So you don't actually need 10 products. You just need to have one product that takes all of these international users into account. In my opinion, there are 3 things. I always like to think that there are 3 things that make international UX, and this is for all of our localizers. This is very, very obvious, but it's localization, internationalization, and UX design. But I think that traditionally well, localization and internationalization have been working together as a team, kind of. But then I think that the user experience design has always been maybe separated from the localization, or the other way around. The localization department is sitting somewhere in the company and then far from the UX team. So I've even seen where these two not having any sort of connection to each other, where they really should be working very closely, because the aim is the same. What they want is the same. So first of all, there's localization. The adapting a product to a service, or service to the different cultures. There's the language aspect that comes in the localization, and this is where we talk about the translation and copywriting processes that will need to support your international UX. Localization tackles the cultural differences and preferences that you need to take into account for the product to feel local and familiar for your users. Then I always like to talk about terminology management. I think it's a very big part of localization, and the thing that will actually make or break the success of your localization, as well as your brand's voice. Let's say that there's a tone of voice project going on in your company, and there is a tone of voice document done in your marketing team, and a lot of effort has been put into it, and you've come up with great, really well working slogans and microcopy with this sort of witty microcopy in your UI, and lots of cultural references and puns, and you feel like you have your tone of voice and this is what you want to present. And then your copy is translated into 10 languages and the results are less than optimal. Like, what happened? Your users may range from, confused to even enraged. So you're left wondering what happened. We did all the right things. We had a tone of voice. And what may have happened is that you perhaps failed to consider how the copy will be perceived in a region where some of your copywriting style is not appropriate, for instance, or that not the same cultural references exist, or the copy simply does not translate. You might be using language that is accidentally offensive or makes people uncomfortable in some way, or when translated, your copy sounds just, sometimes it may sound silly or just somehow off. People necessarily cannot even tell why, but it doesn't resonate.
Exactly. Actually, I just heard somebody mentioning they had created a campaign that mentioned it was like it was kind of fostering creativity, and it was kind of the creator, concept. So it was empowering people to be creators themselves. But when it came to bringing that concept and that kind of logo and that branding messaging over to, for instance, Islamic countries, it didn't quite work because there is only one creator. Obviously, it's Allah, and therefore it would be highly offensive. So that's where the cultural, awareness and the cultural differences are critical to be taken into account. Correct?
Yes, and one of my favorite subjects is tone of voices as well, and I find often happening when I create copy myself for our UI, and I feel like we write in English, and I write something. I think this is now light. I'm sort of taking a more lighter tone in this, and then I have it translated, and then it comes back, and it just, for instance, in Finnish, it might sound. It doesn't translate into that same light tone of voice. It comes back sort of diluted almost, and that's not on the translator at all. It's just about, you have to understand the language, like how language works, and what are natural things to say in different languages. And Finnish is definitely one of the most difficult UI languages, in my opinion.
I would concur. rather complex. Yeah, absolutely. So localization and the other two elements were internationalization and of course user design. So what do you feel are the core considerations when it comes to internationalization?
Yeah, that's actually my next slide. There's the process of getting your software to a state where it can actually be easily localized in any language and without changing the code. So it's really important for your product to be actually international, to be technically ready to be international. So, when the localization team needs 4 plural forms for Russian or that kinds of things, then you need to have that supported in the code before localization starts. There are many considerations in internationalization. We could easily spend a webinar on that topic alone, but when implemented from the start, it will be a small effort with a huge impact on the localization quality. And then if you do it later, that will be costly. We all know that. And in worst cases, I think it won't be done at all, which will ruin the experience for your users, because you won't be able to localize your product in the optimal way. So there are lots of different considerations for internationalization. For instance, starting with Unicode. Sorry. Not all languages have the same character set, so that's needed to be able to show all the characters properly. And surprisingly, I'm drawing from the Finnish language. We are very aware of this with our as and es. So yeah, that's the first thing that we get right when we do internationalization. Then we have different currencies, decimal separators, and units of measurement. These are really important to, if you get this wrong, you are bound to confuse your user, or even have like dramatic results in your invoicing. Names and titles is one of my favorite internationalization topics. Names are different all around the world. Not all names are written first name and last name, first name first and last name last. And then the use of titles, that's really important. So you need to make sure that you allow enough space on your UI, for instance, for your users to be actually able to write their name in full and correctly. I mean, that should be right for all users. And then, you need to show them the respect they expect for instance, in email marketing. So lots of important considerations there. And then obviously date and time is also very different to users. And if you get that wrong, your users will end up showing late or early to their meetings. So yeah, one of the things that I always find will expose problems in your internationalization easily is gender and plurality issues. For instance, like I said, you need 4 different plural endings in Russian. So if you do that language, you'll notice very soon if your internationalization isn't in place. Language direction is another big development and UX consideration as well. Mere mirroring, we all know, is not enough. And although this sort of component comes out of the box as an out-of-the-box solution in many development frameworks, but still, those are lacking, and we still often see products failing in that area. So yeah.
No, I said, yeah, absolutely. I am well aware. Yes, I agree.
All right. So the third aspect is the UX design. In a global product, you need to, for instance, consider the screen space, how much you need for different languages. You simply cannot just design with English, which is a language with relatively short words. You need to add almost 80% more space, for example, for Finnish or German. The fonts are different sizes as well, so that needs to be considered. And preferably all of this needs to be done in the design phase already. So that's where UX and localization teams really should come together. The localization team is there to help the UX team look at the design and the copy from the different languages perspective. So I think that a great way to utilize the localization team is to ask for instance, pseudo translations, sort of imitation of different languages, so that you can test the design for space issues before the actual translations are done. So really, I really hope that the UX teams would see localization as something bringing new to the table and new tools into the table to be able to provide a really good international user experience.
Exactly, an asset really, right? To sort of improve
yes.
and provide the best possible experience
yes.
from the word go. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, definitely. Then obviously there's the use of icons, which can be a tricky thing. We all know that you have to be careful and consider that not all icons carry the same meaning in all cultures. Same goes for colors as well. For instance, the color red in the Western world can mean something like an alarm or danger, where in fact in Asia it represents happiness and joy. So lots of different things that we kind of take for granted when we're designing from Finland or from the Nordics, let's say, and then all of these things doesn't necessarily mean the same things around the world. So lots of considerations there. The use of images, if your product has images, so those need to be relatable for the users. This is something we discuss here all the time with the marketing team, for instance. You know, if the imagery is landscapes or people, then those need to reflect the kinds of landscapes and people the users are used to seeing and can relate to. And then there's the navigation preferences. You have to make sure that the navigation is something that the user is used to, so that the buttons are found where the user expects them to be found. Browsing habits can be different. Another thing to consider is that is your users, are they searchers or browsers? How do they like to find information on your website or on your application? So, for instance, some users prefer to browse your website rather than use the search function. So, you know, for instance, in languages like Chinese, that is quite slow to type, so people might want to find the information by browsing instead.
Excellent points, and I would imagine as well, when designing, I guess the UX designers should be thinking about what sort of download speeds or different kind of internet speeds there may be in the different markets, to make sure that they're not kind of too heavy or might take too long to download, maybe on mobile or whatever. Obviously, the use of different browsers that may be less common, perhaps in you know, kind of the location where the actual product is being designed, or you know, just different platforms that certain target markets and certain users may be utilizing, to make sure that the experience is equally positive across all of those, right?
Yes, definitely, yeah, and you know, you have to know your user to be able to design a really good user experience. So if you cannot be, well, if you're looking at an application, for instance, you need to know what kind of phones are your users using. You cannot just design for a big screen if all your users are using very small devices, for instance, or sort of if your users are in a region where not necessarily, you know, are they iOS users or are they Android users? Yeah, so definitely very important aspects to consider. So you need to know your user, in other words.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So what exactly, I was just going to ask, like, where do we go from here? So we know the theory, so, you know, what do we do?
Yeah, so how do you do this then? What is it that you need to succeed?
Exactly.
Yeah, so I think that the answer is, well, fairly simple, but we all know that it's not. I'd say that you need a design process where all of these things, localization, internationalization, and UX, sort of meet and can cooperate. Like I said, all of these three are needed for successful international products, into making an international product. And one of these cannot happen without the other. I know as a localization manager, I mean, I've never been able to, I've always been very upfront and told my stakeholders that I can't really succeed or reach the end that I want to reach without you. So I've always been depending on the development teams, on the UX team, and on the copywriters, because I know that I cannot produce great quality localization without these other people or other teams. So this kind of cross-functional way of working, I think, is probably very familiar for all localization teams, because you are so dependent on all of these other teams to succeed. So like I said, you need a design process where these three things meet and cooperate, and a good process is one that, of course, suits you and your product and your company. Of course, there's no one size fits all solution for sure, but I think that if you have the following processes, you are well on your way. So I think that a good team for international UX would consist of a localization team, UX writers or copywriters, however your company describes them, UX design team, and an internationalization developer. Not all of these roles necessarily exist in a company that does localization. I for one know I'm at the moment I am a one-person team at HappyOrNot, so I wear many of these hats myself, and I'm sure that there are lots of localization managers out there in the same situation. So, but in an ideal world, this is a good team that would do great things. And I think that a good process would consist of really involving localization and UX writing from the concept phase already. So these teams need to be involved to tackle those, well, the previously mentioned localization considerations. And then in the design finalization phase, where the UX writing would be then polished into, with the cultural considerations in mind. And then,
I was just going to say, I would even go as far as saying, I mean, ideally in a larger organization, it's possible to have the different teams, but even in a kind of a smaller organization or a medium sized organization, it's the functions and it's the awareness that all of these elements will deliver successful international user experience, right? So whoever might look after each of the areas may be different in different organizations, but at least there needs to be an awareness and a synergy across those four functions, all working towards a common goal. Is that how you understand it as well?
Yes, definitely. And even if you are a small team and you don't have all of these roles, then you need to find find your stakeholders and sort of kind of the localization manager or the localization team is often the one finding out who can help me with this, who can help me with that, so that we can actually achieve this. So just finding those people in your company. If you don't have the teams already, then you just find the stakeholders and really you have to probably maybe be the one bringing these ideas into people's, so that people consider them. But localization is, like I said, often a very cross-functional team and function. And then I've never minded the fact that I, as a localization manager, I've tried to sort of search for these functions in the company and get them to work with me. But I think that the key really is to make sure that through the design process and the development process, you always stop and consider, will this work in all the languages and cultures that we offer and the cultures where we operate? What can we add or remove to make it feel more local to our users, for instance, in Asia, Europe, US? So if you have all of these, if you ask these questions every time you're designing, I think you're well on your way, even if you don't have the teams ready in place already.
Fantastic. Tarja, I do have a question for you. Your role is international UX and as in user experience and customer experience. And I guess perhaps this sounds a little bit an ignorant question, but where do you see the difference and how are you handling or approaching the customer experience side of things?
A very good question, not an ignorant question at all. We've been talking a lot about the international user experience here. That's kind of going into the details, in my opinion. And then when you get into the international customer experience, that's the overall experience of your users. So not to be forgotten, and I'm really glad you asked about that, because I mean, the international customer experience spans throughout the whole customer journey, from the point where the customer considers using your product to actually ending the use of your product. So all of that is the customer's journey, and every single touch point on that journey sort of needs to be, you need to be aware of them, and you need to be there for the customer. At HappyOrNot, we're in the business of ensuring better customer experience. So naturally, we started our own customer journey project to ensure that we practice what we preach, in a way. So this was a year-long project that we did, and we have now a dedicated room where this journey can be seen, and it can be seen by anyone in the company who needs it at all times. So it's really like a powerful tool for us to step into the customer's world.
That's you in the picture, Tarja.
Yes, that's me, and that's Eva Viljanen, our technical writer, my very good colleague, who we spent hours discussing terminology and localization and communication. So yeah, she was working with me.
So you have a room fully dedicated to the customer journey.
Yes, we do, and it's
wow.
Like I said, it's such a powerful tool, and you just step in there. I mean, if you want to find answers about how are we serving our customer at this point of their journey, you just go in and you sort of see it. I always feel like it's very useful to visualize things to understand them fully. So just going into that room is really inspiring, and you can sort of focus on very small areas of the journey, or just look at the whole big picture. Yeah.
Can I ask how long did it take you exactly to complete this?
This was a year-long project that we did. We started roughly a year ago. Just want to, it's important to note that it's not really a project that has like a
beginning and an end.
Yeah, it's something that evolves constantly, and we are constantly working on it. So we don't refer to it as being finished by all means. Yeah, and it changes all the time. I mean, obviously our product changes and develops, and we learn more about our customers. So it's really like an organic room that keeps evolving.
And would it be fair to say that it does take a few weeks to kind of do the initial effort, and then it's kind of a work in progress, right?
Yes, it definitely does. And you really need to give it time, because especially if you're doing in a company where you haven't previously done this, and you're sort of now trying to dig deep into what the content is that you send to your customers, and especially if you have really like a large complex product, it's going to take, I would say, instead of weeks, it's going to take months to really get there. But it's really rewarding when you have that room and you can sort of walk through the customer's shoes, really.
Wow, that's fascinating.
Yeah. So yeah, what we did was we started by recognizing these different touch points along the customer's journey, and sort of carefully mapping all the points of contact with the customer, and sort of gathering the content that our customers see and receive from us, digging deep into how they feel about the service along the way as well. So that was really interesting. And it really helped us to see the pain points and where the journey gets disrupted. Where it is where we need to improve and develop. After the journey is now that it's mapped out, it's really easy for me to go out and then just on top of that journey map out the international customer's journey. And how I did that, and what it's actually pretty simple. You just go in with your post-its, and it doesn't have to be like a very this sort of complex process. You can really do wonders with just post-its. Yeah, so I started from the very upper level, and here in the picture, as you can see, there are yellow post-its. Here is the I just started placing the post-its along the way where localized content could be found. And then I would place red post-its where localized content didn't exist yet. And then I could actually see the gaps, like I could visualize them. And next I established whether the gaps were actually real gaps. or whether localized content was actually not needed in those areas. So you cannot look at it in a too straightforward way. Yeah, I mean, if you want to offer a great user experience for your international customers, you really can't underestimate the role of localization. And the fact is that if you get those gaps in the journey, then you don't have a solid customer journey. And as an example, I'd just like to say, you know, if you might localize your product very meticulously on the UI of the product, or the emails and the support materials, well, but then not the support materials. So if you do localize your product but not the support, then what will your customers do when they encounter a problem? You know, if your customers want to use your product in their own language, then why would you not offer support materials in that language as well? You know, of course, before you rush into localizing everything, you need to understand who your users are. And I'm just mentioning this not to make it sound too straightforward or simple. Obviously, while you do this customer journey mapping and sort of make assumptions based on it, you also have to understand who your users are and do the research on your user personas and their preferences, because yeah, they might actually want certain content in English and others in their own language, like I mentioned earlier. So it's not quite as simple as it sounds, but yeah, you have to do the research.
Excellent, excellent. And just one last question on this customer journey room and process, because I think it's fascinating and it's novel and it's just kind of looking at things from a really different perspective. Like, would you like go in and update it every once a month, or how regularly do you kind of go back to these and see how the customer journey has evolved, or is it based on feedback that your kind of customer teams receive, or you know, what triggers, I guess, revisiting this customer journey and the role that localization is playing in it?
Well, I wouldn't say it's not something that I regularly do. I think that it's more like when something comes up, when we find new information, or when I look at data, I go and see if that data has some effect on the journey, or if I can, yeah, it's not like a regular, but on certain intervals. But whenever there's a need to go check, I will go and check and update. Well, when we were doing this within our process, for instance, we were able to see that some of our messaging was not consistent in all touch points, and consequently the localized content's availability wasn't consistent either. So, you know, when that happened, we actually made some changes quite fast based on these findings, and we are now measuring the impact using data from our users to validate if our assumptions were correct, and then I would go in and update the journey based on that. And we are continuing this work every day. We might not update the room every day, but sort of it's kind of something that is always with us, whatever we do. The idea of the journey now is sort of kind of in everyone's at the back of their heads, which is great. And I feel like, you know, ever since we did this, every week there's a new discovery, and we continue to make our service better, and you know, everything from invoicing to delivery messaging gets a new perspective. It's been a real delight to see the benefits of the project in localization, and also I feel like there have been this really nice realizations around the company of like, oh, we need localization here as well. You know, in areas no one realized that we actually could or should have localization involved. So this project has really been beneficial from a localization evangelization point of view as well.
Fascinating, Karja, fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing your experience with us. It's impressive. It's interesting. It's, as I said, it's just a novel in terms of what a lot of companies are not yet doing, but certainly inspiration. A very different angle to evangelize localization and demonstrating the importance of kind of having all of those moving parts synergizing and kind of working together towards the common goal of that optimized customer experience. So I'm going to hand it back to Priscilla for questions from our audience, if there are any. Priscilla?
Yeah, María. First, I'd like to thank Tarja for a fantastic presentation. It was really interesting, very insightful. So thanks, Tarja, and thanks, María. So yes, indeed, we have questions from the audience. So first question I have for Tarja is, Tarja, how can localization managers get involved in international UX and CX in their companies? Where should they start, really?
That's a really good question. I would actually say start from within. Just get excited and accumulate knowledge about UX and CX. So, when you are actually yourself excited about something, it really helps convince others that who need to be convinced that you are needed in this area. So that's my first advice. Just read about UX. So there's so much material out there, so educate yourself on it so that you can go and educate others on how these two functions can work together. For me, I got involved in this as a UX writer almost by chance. I had a role where I was writing the product copy and also I was localizing it. I think it was a really good way to work and consider all of these aspects. And I'm really happy that I got excited about UX and got to be involved because it has made me look at localization differently as well. Just through sort of the understanding how UX and CX practices and how that's what you need to consider has given me a different perspective on localization as well. And then I would say that you need to make friends in a UX team. So ask questions and observe how they are doing and get involved. But I would say that the thing is that, you might not get invited to join. So it's really, it might depend on you and the localization team to be that promoter of cooperation. But I can say that it's well worth it.
Thanks very much, Tarja. I also have a second question for you today. Tell us, how can a company measure the impact and benefit of adopting a holistic approach that amalgamates localization and internationalization in the overall international and UX and CX? Like, are you currently doing this in your company, for example?
Yeah, I mean, another great question. Data is really something that people are talking about in the localization industry now a lot as well, and that's really something I do agree that that you really need to be looking at data to do successful localization. And if there's a time when you didn't have this sort of UX and localization cooperation, and then you have a time when you started doing that, you can obviously compare the results from those two, and you can measure this with customer satisfaction surveys and customer interviews. We look at health score of our service based on these kinds of things, for instance. You can look at data like users in different languages. Has that changed since you started working in a new way? You can look at number of leads in different markets. Are you getting leads from markets that you maybe necessarily didn't get due to some of these actions that you've been doing in a new way? There's a lot of data that you can look at, and if your company has a data team, that's another team where you should make friends too, I think. Yeah, but also here at HappyOrNot, we eat our own porridge, so we use our own products to measure satisfaction across our service platforms as well. So I'm very, very sort of fortunate to be working in a company specializing in this. But I do look at data of our users in different languages in the service as well, and how the number of users changes, and how does the way that they use our product change, for instance, if I've done some actions. But of course, with data, it's you have to be careful. It's nothing is sort of absolute or definite, and you you shouldn't make too many assumptions based on data either. And the point is to keep looking at the data and sort of analyze it in a critical way, and really to know what data is worth following. You know, for instance, number of users doesn't always tell the whole story of whether your localization has been successful or not. But these are really good tools.
Thank you so much, Tarja. It's fantastic and fascinating, really. Now, if we didn't get an opportunity to answer your question today, of course, we'll endeavor to answer all of them after the webinar. And now I think I'll hand you over to María for a quick summary before we wrap up for today.
Thank you, Priscilla, and thank you, Tarja, so much. Once again, huge thank you for sharing your insights, your experience, and for leading the way, really. There are, you know, I think our conversation has opened up some other questions, like where should localization sit, for instance? You know, are they kind of traditional, perhaps under technology or under operations or whatever localization teams may currently be sitting? Those might need to be relooked at by companies, and maybe they need to be brought closer to the user experience teams from an organizational perspective as well, to facilitate that collaboration and that synergy. So thank you, everybody, also for joining us today, either for our live conversation or indeed for listening to the recording if you couldn't make the live webinar. Thank you for putting up with my voice. I hope it wasn't too painful for anybody listening. I hope you found it as enlightening and insightful as I have. And by all means, let's keep in touch with Tarja or myself. Thank you so much once again, Tarja.
Thank you, María, and thanks to all the team behind the webinar. It was a pleasure working with you, and thanks to the audience. Thanks for listening. It was a real pleasure talking to you today, and yeah, keep in touch if you. I would love to discuss with you if you have anything you would like to talk about.
Thanks, Tarja and María. Fantastic webinar today. And again, yes, thanks to our audience for taking part. So if you'd like to go back and listen to the webinar, of course, the recording will be available in the coming days on the vistatec.com website. Thank you, everybody. This webinar has now come to a close.